Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Historia Politica Publica. This is an episode about Gandhi and a book that he wrote in 1908, which is called Hind, Swaraj or Indian Home Rule. Through this book, he defines some concepts such as passive resistance, the idea to use non-violence in order to achieve the means of the Indian society at that time. It was a time in which India was colonized by the English, so Gandhi wanted self-determination, but he avoided to use a kind of violence force to overthrow the colonizers, and rather he appealed for a other kind of force. He called it a soul force, which for him means this idea of not using physical force, but rather staying there, disobeying the laws, and so on. First of all, I will talk a bit about Gandhi, although it won't be necessary to extend myself that much because Mahatma Gandhi is a figure well known by everybody. But just to give a brief summary about Gandhi and put some background at the time that he wrote this book, Hind, Swaraj. Mahatma Gandhi originally was called Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Afterwards, the epithet Mahatma, which in Sanskrit means something like venerable or great soul, applied to him in 1914, so 6 years later that he wrote this book. He was born in 1869. He was killed in 1948, the year of the partition of India between India and the area that we now known as Pakistan. And he was an Indian revolutionary, anti-colonial nationalist, and political ethicist who employed non-violent resistance to lead the successful campaign for Indians' independence from the British rule. Later, he inspired movement for civil rights and freedom across the world. People like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr. were greatly inspired by him, same as Mahatma Gandhi was also inspired by Henry David Thoreau, which in 1847 published an essay called On Civil Disobedience. There are many parallelisms between Gandhi and Thoreau, because Thoreau also appealed to the idea of disobeying unjust laws. In the case of Thoreau, he was living in the United States in the time that slavery was perpetrated across the region, especially in the south, and also there was a war in Mexico. So Thoreau decided to not pay taxes to finance a slavist government who was also perpetrating conflict in other areas in order to conquer new territories. Similarly, Gandhi refused the idea of obeying unjust laws, and this is very important, and I will delve further into the different chapters of his book because he has written widely about that. His book Hind, Swaraj is divided in 20 chapters. I will try to cover 7 or 8 of them that I think can summarize widely his thought. Gandhi, just to give a brief summary of his political background, was living in South Africa for 21 years from 1893. In 1915, when he was 45, he returned to India and soon set about organizing peasants, farmers, and urban laborers to protest against excessive land tax and discrimination. Those were the years of the First World War, and he refused to condemn the British for getting involved in the conflict. Why did he so, even though he was a pacifist? Well, he understood the geopolitical situation at that time and knew that in order to appeal to the benevolence of the British Empire, he forced himself to support them in their enterprise against Germany and the other countries of the Triple Alliance, like Italy, Austria, and Germany. In 1921, after the First World War, he assumed the leadership of the Indian National Congress and was hugely involved in the political institution for many years. Using anti-colonial measures based on non-violence and passive resistance, he tried to overthrow the British Empire, led to the process of decolonization, and in that sense he started the Salt March in 1930 in order to force the British to quit India. He was imprisoned many times and for many years in both South Africa and India. This idea of Gandhi was based on India with religious pluralism and was challenged in 1940s by Muslim nationalists, and in August 1947, after the Second World War, Britain gained independence. However, the British Indian Empire was partitioned into two dominions, Pakistan and India. India was now dominated by the Hindu majority, whereas Pakistan was dominated by the Muslim majority. So 1 year later, he was assassinated by a Hindu nationalist who refused his idea to kind of giving power to the Muslim in Pakistan and so on. And there were many kind of conflicts going on there. But I believe that the life of Gandhi serves to understand the political context of that time with the First World War, Second World War. He was very involved in all this movement. He was in South Africa at the time of the segregation between black and white, so he had a huge knowledge of the whole world. He was a person with a huge high level of consciousness, and we'll explore this more about what he thought in his book. Interestingly, the book, as I mentioned, was written in 1908, and it is fascinating how the format of the book is, because it is written as a kind of interview between Gandhi, which is called the editor, and the reader, which apparently is the other people who is asking question. This was an answer to the Indian School of Violence, and it was published in the columns of the Indian Opinion. So he wanted to refuse these ideas that only using violence could be effective to overthrow the British Empire in India. And in order to do so, he uses a lot of aphorism during his book. Remember the format of question and answer. So the reader is asking Gandhi many questions, challenge his view, but Gandhi is able to answer properly and giving kind of stimulating answer, which I think have prevalent meanings nowadays. For example, in the chapter 1, he speaks about the Congress and its official. He mentioned how a tree does not grow in one day, pointing how the people must be patient in order to know the truth. This is not something that can happen from night to morning. It requires an effort of people willing to learn, to organize in different groups to each other, and to be patient for the outcome to arrive. Also, he pointed that a notion that is desirous of securing home rule cannot afford to despise its ancestors. Home rule is the idea that was followed in Ireland, for example, and in India, which meant the self-determination of the nation. Both Ireland and India were under the yoke of the British Empire, and they wanted to create their own rules. They did not want to be submitted anymore to the English, and in that sense, they advocate for the idea of home rule. At the same time, Gandhi was smart enough to try to be pragmatic to gain the favor of the British, and in his book he mentioned how the English people have a good soul, although they are following the capitalist system. They are being hypnotized by the money, and this is their problem, according to him. And he's very critical about modern civilization, which I think this is fundamental to understand his thought. He, in the preface, he mentioned that he's not against all the kind of technology, because for him the modern European civilization is this kind of current paradigm intellectual which has given too much importance for the technological advance rather to the kind of inner qualities within the human, such as honesty, nobility, solidarity, or altruism. So for him, the idea is to use technologies that can help humanity, such as vehicles to kind of travel along great distance, or the use of medicines to save life of the people. But one of the kind of technologies that he refused most is the weapons, which it is a clear example of how modern and advanced technology can work in order to exterminate thousands and even millions of people. In that sense, he points that, quote, the English people are somewhat more selfish than others is true, but that does not prove that every Englishman is bad. So he praised the British and also criticized them. He points also how they have been for over a century in India oppressing their people, and yet he also criticized the own Indian people for submit them to the invaders on the first time, and he's very clear about that. So in that sense, when the reader kind of blame all the false opinion within the British conquerors, Gandhi mentions that the Indian prince that initially in the 19th century and at the end of the 18th century were willing to use the British weapons in order to defeat their other enemies within India, gave legitimacy for the British to conquer the country. And the problem is that for many decades, millions of people have suffered for this decision taken into account like 200 years ago. Another of the episodes, it is about the partition of Bengal. He mentioned how there is a division between the moderates, which he calls the slow party, and the extremists that he calls the impatient party. Points how such division will not last long, that it all depends upon the leaders how long they will last. In other words, he gives a lot of importance to the figure of the leader of the party. Even though he was an advocate of the idea of the common solidarity, the use of millions of people in order to push for a change within the system, he also knew that the power of oratory of different figures was fundamental to kind of channel this discontent that spread among the masses in India. In addition, there are many episodes interesting to talk about. There is this about discontent and unrest, in which he points that may the present unrest in India be considered unnecessary and therefore a proper state. He uses the metaphor of the awakening, like a person who is sleeping, is dreaming. He believes within the dream that what he's seeing is the reality that he's facing, and when he awakes, he discovers that it was just a dream. In that sense, he points that in order to awake the people, it is necessary to speak with them, to teach them, to engage with each other, because otherwise people will believe that the only means for change the system will be through the use of violence, or worse for Gandhi, just to submitting into obedience to the unjust laws. According to him, quote, the knowledge that there is unrest will, it is highly probable, enable us to outgrow it, end quote. This is very important because for him, the first kind of point to solve the problem is to recognize that there is one. So if the Indian people in the 20th century were willing to believe that they were being oppressed, that was the first step towards the liberation. But it was important that the people realized that living under the yoke of the British Empire was inherently bad for their life. It was oppressing their ideas. They were living in a state of slavery. They did not have the self-determination in order to proceed with their ideas of freedom. At the same time, it is important to say that Gandhi did not believe that just overthrowing the British, the society will be much better. He is even he's warning against a group of Indian nationalists taking the place of the British and imposing their own laws without considering the opinion of the millions of people. This obviously has resonance with the idea of Frantz Fanon during the process of the colonization of Algeria, in which he was afraid that there were some kind of African people who had been influenced by the British and will take the position of power in the new liberated country, and they will continue with the ideals imposed by the Western nations. In other words, it is important that for this kind of movement of liberation, being Frantz Fanon, Gandhi, and many other revolutionaries across the 20th century, it was the idea of talking with the masses of people, listening to their demands, and all together could create a current in which they could establish a view to push forward. In one of the chapters, Gandhi defines what is Swaraj. The book, remember, is called In Swaraj, which can be translated as Indian Home Rule. And for him, the idea is that it is important for create the Swaraj to not copy the English people, the English mechanism. In that sense, he points, do we want English rule without the Englishman? This is not the Swaraj that I want. And he points how it will be important to create the conditions that are happening in India and henceforth following different mechanisms that were created in Europe, which for him is like the epitome of evil, with the creation of the modern technologies, the continuous state of war, the conflict, and so on. This book was written in 1904, so just 6 years later the First World War started, and perhaps Gandhi, same as Kropotkin or Friedrich Engels, was foreseeing a big conflict in the following years because the countries of Europe were spending a lot of money in weapons, and it seems that it was inevitably that this kind of conflict should arise soon in the future. In that vein, in the next chapter, he's very critical about England, and the chapter is called The Condition of England. He points how, quote, Parliament has not yet done a single good thing. He's referring to the Parliament of England. See, he points how it is good in theory, but it fails in practice. And he recovers a quote by Thomas Carlyle, the writer of the French Revolution, who mentioned that, quote, Parliament is the talking shop of the world, end quote. This can be extrapolated even to nowadays, as we see how in many parliaments in Europe there are nonsensical discussions, and those debates that are really fruitful, that are being proceed through a kind of critical thinking, which are stimulating for the audience and help to exchange some laws which are unjust, are being silenced because the media is trying always to portray the more sensationalist debates, which are incendiary, in order to infuse this kind of rage among the public and henceforth win more audience. In that sense, Gandhi points that it's fundamental to think critically and the process of learning in order to, in that case, give a better future for India. And he is even he's very diplomatic with the reader in his book. The reader, again, is the allegory of the audience who are criticizing the views of non-violence and passive resistance. And he points that, quote, you cannot accept my views at once, and this is only right, end quote. In other words, he doesn't want that people just follow his message because he's Gandhi, because he has studied in London or whatever. He wishes that people can listen to him and refute his ideas or support them, but always with a kind of process of thinking critically about that he's saying. And this is what has to happen in the whole world. It must be a process that can save ourselves, and we need to be prepared to be able to understand other views, to debate them, and always thinking critically about what we have been hearing or reading around. Going back to his criticism of the condition of England, he points to the corruption in Parliament, pointing that they are not patriotic, they are open to subtler influence. He points how people are bribed with different kind of honors, and he defines them as people who, quote, have neither real honesty nor a living consciousness, end quote. And in one of the first criticism about the power of the media, Gandhi explains that, quote, their newspaper is their Bible, end quote. The problem of this condition for him is due to modernizations, and he finished the chapter saying that the nations of Europe are becoming degraded and ruined day by day. In that sense, the power of the media is fundamental because the modern civilization has created an international network of news that is spreading all around the world. Gandhi was smart enough to see how this media could have a great influence among the people, and this was controlled by the elites at the time, same as happening nowadays, and henceforth he relates the Constitution of England, the problem of not following the laws and just kind of obeying those that were unjust for the mass of people, because consequently those were the laws that were more beneficial for the tiny minority that was ruling on top of their nations. So we'll finish here the episode because there are other chapters to talk about. There is one about civilization, one in which he mentioned why was India lost in the 18th century, how can India become free, a comparison between Italy and India in which he speaks about Mazzini and Garibaldi, the use of brute force, and the chapter 17, which I think is the most interesting of the whole book, about passive resistance, the power of love to change the consciousness of humanity, the fundamental idea to join with millions of people intersectional solidarity, and other kind of aspect that I will explore in the next episode about Gandhi.